Jerry has always had a passion for antiques. Since he was young, he had spent his weekends exploring flea markets and antique fairs in search of rare pieces and fascinating stories. His collection was a testament to his enthusiasm: gilded watchmakers, ornate furniture, and a multitude of curious objects adorned his home. It was at a local auction that Jerry found his latest find. The hall was packed with people, most of them looking for bargains among antique furniture and works of art. The atmosphere was charged with the murmur of negotiations and the ringing of bells announcing the lots. Jerry moved between the tables with an attentive eye, knowing well the art of finding the gold hidden among the junk. When the auctioneer presented the next item, Jerry raised his head, attracted by the glint of something peculiar. It was an antique wristwatch with an elegant and discreet design, its metal case slightly worn by time. The watch looked simple, but its combination of numbers and hands revealed a subtle sophistication. Something about the object caught Jerry's eye. It was different, and that intrigued him. The auctioneer made a brief mention of the piece, highlighting the fact that the watch had belonged to a man who, according to rumors, had faced a series of tragedies in his life. The auctioneer spoke these words with a lightness that didn't seem to match the weight of the story, and the brief mention was enough to pique Jerry's curiosity. He knew that the most intriguing objects often carried equally fascinating stories. Jerry decided to bid on the watch. The bidding was relatively low, and he got the object for a modest price. It wasn't a valuable bargain, but the watch awakened something deeper in Jerry. He wasn't entirely sure what it was, but the watch almost seemed to have an aura of its own, as if it was waiting to be discovered. Taking the watch home, Jerry examined it more closely. The metal had marks from use, and the glass was slightly scratched, but nothing that couldn't be restored. He didn't attach much importance to the history of the previous owner. For him, the watch was an enigma to be solved, a new mystery to add to his collection. However, he didn't know that this simple auction find would end up becoming the center of a plot far more complex and disturbing than any story he had ever heard. Jerry couldn't help himself and spent the night examining the wristwatch. The metal case was a little cold and rough to the touch, but when he turned on the mechanism, the watch seemed to work perfectly. He set the time and, satisfied with his purchase, decided to wear it the next day, as if it were a good luck charm. At first, everything seemed normal. Jerry started his day with a sense of anticipation and excitement. The watch had an air of antique charm that he appreciated, and he felt good to have it on his wrist. The day looked promising, and Jerry was looking forward to showing off his new find to some friends. However, something unusual happened just before noon. Jerry was in his office, immersed in work, when he heard a faint click coming from his watch. He looked at the dial and noticed that a small counter on the edge of the dial had started to turn slowly, starting a countdown. The number displayed was 30 minutes. Jerry frowned, confused. The counter didn't seem to be a normal function for a wristwatch. He tried to ignore it, thinking it might be a mechanical fault, but with each passing second, the countdown continued inexorably. Jerry stood up to take a break, pushing the disturbing thought away. He headed for the kitchen to get a coffee, still trying to convince himself that it was all just a misunderstanding. The countdown reached 0 while he was in the kitchen. Suddenly, the sound of something breaking echoed through the house. Jerry ran back into the study and saw that the coffee cup on the table had shattered, spilling hot coffee all over the floor. The hot liquid spread quickly, causing a small mess and unforeseen discomfort. Jerry looked at his watch, astonished. What had been a simple misunderstanding about the clock's function now looked like a more sinister warning. He leaned over the table and tried to clean up the mess, feeling a strange sense of unease. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't figure out exactly what it was. That same day, Jerry decided to check if there were any other functions on the watch that could justify the countdown. He revisited the manual that came with the watch, but found only basic instructions and no mention of the counter. He tried adjusting and tinkering with the mechanism, but nothing seemed to alter the counter's behavior. The watch, although apparently a harmless object, was beginning to take on a sinister tone in his mind. Jerry was determined to find out more about the piece and its peculiar workings. He couldn't deny the growing feeling that the clock was not just a mere antique artifact, but an object charged with some kind of mysterious power. As he prepared for the evening, Jerry couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking. The watch was quiet on his wrist, but the mysterious countdown still disturbed him. He began to wonder if the watch had something else to show, something he still couldn't understand. Whatever it was, Jerry knew that the watch was only just beginning to reveal its secrets, and he was ready to find out what else was to come. Jerry's restlessness only increased as the days went by. The countdown on the clock seemed to follow a pattern with no apparent logic. Whenever it started, he could be sure that something unexpected and usually unpleasant would happen. Most of the time, the events were small and inconvenient, but the frequency with which they recurred and the degree of accuracy with which the clock predicted them began to bother Jerry. One morning, Jerry was on his way to work when the counter on his watch activated, marking 45 minutes. At first, he tried to ignore it, but shortly afterwards, while driving, the car began to make a strange sound. Jerry took the vehicle to the garage, and after a quick inspection, the mechanic informed him that he had been lucky to notice the problem in time. A part was about to fail, which could have caused an accident. Jerry's sense of unease was growing. He decided to talk to a friend, Lucas, who was also passionate about antiques. However, when Lucas heard the story, he just smiled and thought that Jerry was getting carried away by superstition. "Old clocks can have strange defects," said Lucas, without paying much attention to Jerry's story. The following evening, while Jerry was watching a movie at home, the clock's counter started a new 20-minute countdown. He tried not to worry and concentrated on the movie, but the feeling that something was about to happen was palpable. When the countdown ended, the light in the room flickered before going out completely. The blackout lasted a few minutes and, when the light came back on, Jerry realized that one of the wires in the circuit was loose and had almost caused a short circuit. Jerry could no longer ignore the signals. He decided to try one last experiment. He started writing down the moments when the countdown began and the events that followed. With each incident, the pattern seemed clearer and more disturbing. Each time the clock counted down, an unpleasant event materialized. It was no coincidence. In search of an explanation, Jerry began to investigate the clock's history further. He visited a renowned antique store and spoke to an expert in antique watches. The expert confirmed that the watch was a rare model, but couldn't explain the countdown or the events associated with it. The expert mentioned that some antique watches were known to have strange characteristics due to wear and tear or alterations to the mechanics, but nothing that could explain Jerry's peculiar behavior. Jerry became increasingly obsessed and began to feel as if he was being watched. Every time the clock started, he was on alert, trying to anticipate what might go wrong. His surroundings seemed increasingly oppressive and unsettling, and he found himself constantly waiting for the next incident, which seemed to come with terrifying precision. The events became more frequent and more disturbing. Although logic said it was just a coincidence, Jerry couldn't ignore the growing feeling that the watch was more than just an antique shop piece. With each new warning from the clock, he began to wonder if he was being prepared for something much more sinister than simple discomfort. The clock seemed to be becoming a constant and oppressive presence in his life, and Jerry was increasingly convinced that he needed to find out what was really going on before it was too late. Jerry was consumed by the restlessness caused by the clock. With each new alert, the feeling that something dark was behind the object grew. Determined to find out more about the piece and its past, he decided to investigate the history of the clock in greater depth. The first stage of his investigation took him to a local library, where he spent hours leafing through old newspapers and auction records. Jerry discovered that the watch had been sold at various auctions over the decades, always carrying with it an aura of mystery. But what caught his attention most was a newspaper clipping about the watch's previous owner, a man called Charles Pembroke. Pembroke was a name that often appeared in reports about tragedies and disasters. The newspaper reported that Pembroke had lost his wife and children in an unexplained fire at their home, and shortly afterwards, he himself died in a car accident. The way the tragedies followed, Pembroke seemed almost supernatural. The descriptions of the events were shrouded in a mystery that made readers wonder if there was something deeper going on. Jerry decided to look for more information about Pembroke, and his research led him to an archive of historical records at the town hall. There, he found documents about Pembroke's life and discovered that he had been a respected businessman, but also involved in some controversial ventures. There were rumors that Pembroke had made a suspicious deal with an unknown group shortly before the tragedies began to occur. However, the exact details of the deal were never revealed. Pembroke's story became increasingly dark and fascinating. Jerry began to consider the possibility that the clock might be associated with a curse or a sinister fate. As his interest grew, he began to talk to historians and experts in antique objects, trying to find out if there was any explanation for the strange events that were happening to the clock. During a visit to a specialist antique dealer, Jerry was introduced to an expert in antique watchmaking called Martin. Martin examined the watch carefully and revealed that, although the watch was a rare model, there was no record of it having any special function or mechanism related to countdowns. The expert also mentioned something intriguing. Some antique clocks have a peculiar aura. Sometimes, objects carry the energy of the people who owned them. You may be feeling the energy of the former owner. Jerry was perplexed by this explanation, but began to see a connection between Martin's words and the events he had been experiencing. If the watch was charged with the energy or destiny of the former owner, this could explain why it seemed to predict negative events. Desperate for answers, Jerry decided to visit the site where Charles Pembroke's old house had stood. The house had been demolished years ago, but the land on which it had been built was still a vacant, abandoned space. As he walked around the site, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu and an aura of melancholy that seemed to hang over the land. It was as if the place itself was loaded with the memories and suffering of the past. Jerry sat down in what had once been the house's garden and began to reflect on what he had discovered. If the clock really was linked to Pembroke's suffering, then perhaps it was trying to communicate something, or perhaps it was simply transmitting the negative energy accumulated over the years. When Jerry returned home, he was determined to understand the connection between the clock and Charles Pembroke's dark past. He felt he was getting closer to the truth, but the feeling that something terrible was coming still haunted him. With the new perspective on the clock, Jerry prepared himself to face the next challenge that fate seemed to be preparing for him. With each countdown, his unease grew, and he was beginning to feel that he needed to discover the purpose of the clock before it was too late. With a growing sense of despair, Jerry decided that the only possible solution to get rid of the storm caused by the watch was to get rid of it. The feeling that the object was shaping his destiny in a sinister way had taken him over completely, and he was determined to escape its influence. The problem was that despite his best efforts, the watch always seemed to find a way of coming back to him. The next morning, Jerry prepared a small box and placed the watch inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. He took it out of the house and drove to the city dump. There, he placed the box in one of the large containers, mixing it in with other discarded items. Satisfied with his decision, Jerry drove home, hoping that this would be the end of his torment. However, something strange happened. On returning home, Jerry found the watch on his wrist again. His first reaction was disbelief. He re-examined the object, making sure he had left it in storage. A sense of panic overtook him, and he began to wonder if the watch really possessed some kind of supernatural power. Determining that it couldn't have been a mistake or a coincidence, Jerry decided to try a different approach. Instead of simply throwing it away, he looked for a safer place to dispose of it. That same evening, he went to an antique store that was about to close. He spoke to the owner, an elderly man called Harold, and explained that he had found an old watch that he no longer wanted. Harold, with a skeptical look on his face, accepted the watch, although he didn't show much enthusiasm. Jerry hoped that by leaving the object in the hands of a specialist, he could finally get rid of it. However, on returning home, Jerry noticed that the watch had reappeared on his desk. It was as if it had an instinct of its own to return to him. Desperate and frustrated, Jerry decided to take a more drastic measure. He decided to dismantle the clock, believing that this might prevent its return. With a screwdriver and a small toolbox, he began to carefully dismantle the watch. Each piece he removed seemed charged with a strange energy. When he had finally finished, he threw the pieces into a box and sealed it with adhesive tape. Jerry believed that now he could finally be free of the watch's influence. However, when he opened the box the next morning to check, he found the watch parts reassembled and the whole object back to its original state. Terror struck Jerry. The watch was somehow restoring itself, defying all his attempts to get rid of it. Feeling completely powerless, Jerry began to consider the possibility that the watch was connected to something much deeper and more sinister than he had imagined. The idea that the clock had a will of its own, or that it was linked to supernatural forces, was beginning to take shape in his mind. The clock kept ticking, and Jerry, now more than ever, felt the growing pressure to discover the object's purpose before the situation became unbearable. He was determined to find out the truth about the watch and what, or who, was behind its strange ability to return whenever he tried to get rid of it. Jerry realized that the watch wasn't just an old object. It was a riddle that he needed to solve. He was increasingly convinced that the watch had an evil purpose and that his own safety was at stake. With a mixture of fear and determination, he prepared to face the next chapter of his investigation, aware that the clock would not give up so easily. Jerry was on edge. Each day seemed to bring a new and more intense trial, and the clock was becoming an oppressive and constant presence in his life. The countdown that had once seemed random had now become relentless and regular, as if it were approaching a cataclysmic event. Jerry felt the tension growing with each new warning from the clock, and his panic was reaching unsustainable levels. One night, the clock started counting down 12 hours. Jerry looked at the number, and the sense of dread he felt was palpable. He knew that the time interval was significant, and the fact that the counter was ticking off so many hours instead of minutes added to his fear. The clock seemed to be preparing him for something much more serious than the minor accidents of the previous days. Jerry tried to rationalize the situation. He spent the night researching everything he could about Charles Pembroke and the history of the clock. If the clock really was linked to tragedies, perhaps the countdown was a warning of a bigger event. But what could it be? Jerry felt he needed to prepare for the worst, but he didn't know exactly what he should do. During the hours of counting, he tried to distract himself, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave him. He checked all his locks, locked doors and windows, and even asked a friend, Lucas, to spend the night with him, although Lucas still wasn't completely convinced of the seriousness of the situation. Lucas arrived and spent the night, but the tension was so high that he couldn't relax. When the meter reached 0, a sepulchral silence overtook the house. Jerry and Lucas looked at each other, anxious and apprehensive. The silence was interrupted by a muffled sound coming from upstairs. Jerry and Lucas quickly went upstairs to investigate, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Disconcerted, Jerry tried to continue his evening, but fear wouldn't let him. He lay in bed, but was unable to sleep. The feeling of being watched was constant, and the silence seemed almost as threatening as the sound of imminent events. When the clock started ticking again the next morning, this time with a countdown of just 5 minutes, Jerry was in a state of high alert. He and Lucas were in the kitchen, waiting for something to happen. The counter buzzed and began to play ominous music as it hit 0, and a sudden tremor ran through the house. The floor seemed to vibrate slightly. Jerry ran outside and looked at his car, parked in the garage. He had noticed a strange stain under the vehicle, as if there was a leak. Heart pounding, he checked the car and discovered that there was a fuel leak. If he hadn't checked in time, the fuel could have caused a serious fire or even an explosion. With their adrenaline still running high, Jerry and Lucas tried to find some logic in the clock's behavior. They were beginning to consider the possibility that the watch wasn't just predicting events, but was perhaps actively trying to intervene in their lives, guiding them to avoid or prepare for danger. The feeling that the clock was more than just an ancient artifact was becoming inescapable. Jerry was increasingly convinced that the object was connected to something bigger and more sinister, something that involved forces beyond his comprehension. The clock seemed to be manifesting itself in increasingly concrete and dangerous ways, and the idea that it was being guided by an evil entity or some kind of terrible destiny was beginning to make sense. Jerry felt increasingly desperate to discover the real purpose of the watch and how he could end the influence it had over his life. He knew he was racing against time, and the clock seemed to be preparing him for something of great importance. With a sense of urgency, Jerry decided that he needed to fully understand what was happening before it was too late. The feeling that the clock was ticking on a predestined path of dark and dangerous events was now unbearable for Jerry. After the incident with the fuel leak, he decided it was time to face the situation head-on. He needed definitive answers and was willing to do whatever it took to understand the true nature of the clock and break its hold on his life. Determined to get to the truth, Jerry returned to the local library and searched for historical records that might provide more information about Charles Pembroke and his supposedly mysterious deal. He spent hours analyzing old documents and looking for any clue that might explain the clock's behavior. During his research, Jerry found a reference to an old manuscript that mentioned an obscure practice of cursing involving personal objects. According to the manuscript, some people, when they felt they were on the brink of ruin, sought to seal their fates in objects that held great significance for them. These objects, when they passed into new hands, could carry the curse or energy of the previous owner, causing harmful events for the new possessor. Jerry immediately associated this practice with what he was experiencing with the watch. If Charles Pembroke had really sealed his curse on the watch, that would explain why the object was triggering dangerous and disturbing events in his life. With this new perspective, Jerry knew he had to find a way to break the curse. He sought help from experts in the occult and ancient practices, but most of his attempts were unsuccessful. However, one of the experts, a woman called Eloise, suggested that the only way to neutralize a curse of this kind was to perform a cleansing ritual specifically aimed at the object in question. Eloise guided Jerry through the ritual, which involved elements such as salt, specific herbs, and a type of incantation to dispel the negative energy. With all the instructions in mind, Jerry prepared the space in his house for the ritual, choosing a room where the clock could be centralized and the environment controlled. On the night of the ritual, Jerry followed each step precisely, lighting candles and positioning the elements around the clock. Eloise was there to guide him through the process, and the atmosphere was charged with tension. As he recited the words of the incantation and performed the prescribed actions, a sensation of warmth and a slight vibration began to emanate from the clock. As the ritual progressed, Jerry felt a strange presence in the room, as if something was trying to resist his attempt to dispel the curse. The tension in the room increased, and the clock began to vibrate more intensely, its hands spinning frantically. Jerry and Eloise continued the ritual, defying the force that seemed to be fighting against them. Finally, when the incantation was complete, the clock stopped vibrating and the countdown ceased. A sense of relief and calm settled over the room. Jerry felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders, and the atmosphere that had previously been charged with a sense of threat was now clear and peaceful. With the ritual complete, Jerry looked at the clock, which was now silent and inert. He knew that although the ritual might have neutralized the curse, there were still questions about what had really happened to Charles Pembroke and why the clock had such an influence. However, the relief of knowing that the object was no longer causing dangerous events was enough for him. Jerry put the watch away in a safe place, away from his daily reach. He continued to reflect on his experience and the complexity of what he had faced. Although the influence of the watch had diminished, he was aware that the impact of this experience on his life would not be easily forgotten. The account of his experience became an important part of his life, and a lesson in the hidden mysteries that sometimes lurk in seemingly ordinary objects. Jerry learned that some things are better left in the past, and curiosity can sometimes come at a high price.